Welcome, everybody. I hope your day is off to a wonderful start. I have the privilege of welcoming each one of you. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Minneapolis Foundation. It's Chris Beach. Been at the foundation for nearly 6 years, and we've been dreaming about what it would be like to work together as community foundations across the country to really start to roll up our sleeves. Oftentimes, we come together and we talk about best practice. We think about ways to really do the work of the community foundation in more meaningful ways. One of the things lately we've been thinking about is how do we do it together though? How can we bring community voice and community need to this conversation and help support donors at our foundations to better understand what that might look like? We are joined with funders, community members, nonprofit leaders, all engaged in hoping to take action at a critical time, a critical moment. There's significant need to help feed people in our country. Here today is 6 community foundations with nearly $9 billion under management, assets under management, all thinking about how do we talk about that idea of helping to feed people, especially around this needs right now. We want to work together with donors to bring them closer to the groundwork. What does that look like? That's one of the things, in particular at the Minneapolis Foundation, we've been spending a lot of time on. A key role of a donor advised fund holder, we believe, is to engage and take action, to learn, to think of what are those community needs that are out there and how can I actually use my fund? Rather than have the fund sit and just grow, we want to help facilitate, move, bring people together, like I said, just like this moment. We want to cut through those headlines today. We want you to listen, learn, to engage in new ways. We want more than ever, we think that there's a time for you to think about this work. Today is the day to actually spend time testing your limits, to learn more and engage. Like I said, there's 6 different community foundations, 15 different states. Feeding America is here, a national organization talking about what that looks like. Community food banks are here talking about what is the work, what does it look like. I'm just so excited for this moment. I'm excited to work together. I'm excited to be in the conversation. Kicking us off and leading the conversation is Sean O'Grady. He's the board chair at Feeding America. He's a donor of the Minneapolis Foundation. And Sean, I can't thank you enough for leading this conversation.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. And good to be with all of you on this Friday afternoon. I want to thank all the community foundation leaders and fund holders for joining this conversation. I think you'll find it informative. I know many of you already are engaged in our mission of fighting food insecurity and battling against hunger and creating a nation where no one goes hungry here in the U.S. Before we start, just know how grateful we are for the generosity that you've already shown. We're going to try and provide some insights to you today on where we are at this moment. We pulled together this meeting because there's a lot going on in the hunger space right now. And to be clear, we're at a moment that is pretty crucial, and we'll give you a sense for why that is. It's an important moment for Feeding America and the 200 food banks that are part of our network and the 60,000 partner agencies that are on the front lines. But it's mostly a crucial moment for the people that we serve. And so we want to make sure that you have a sense for what's going on, and then we can answer some of your questions and get into our dialogue with the panel. So if you have a question, Maggie McCracken is gathering up those. All you have to do is put it into the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of our dialogue. Before I turn it over to our awesome panel for the day, I wanted to give you some brief context because the world of food insecurity may be a spot that is familiar to you, or it may not. And sometimes it's so big that it's hard to get your arms around. I'm going to try and do this without burying you with numbers. That would make me happy. I love numbers, but I'm going to try and make this sort of digestible. So I'm going to start with a couple numbers because they're the basic numbers that we talk about all the time. And that is to give you a sense for how big is the issue of food insecurity in the US. And two numbers that we think about are, first of all, how many Americans are dealing with food insecurity? And that number right now is 47 million Americans. So it's a big problem. It's not a small problem. And the other number we talk about is 1 in 5 children deal with food insecurity. I'm sure many of you who are on the call are parents, I think nothing would be more difficult than to see your own child going hungry. So let's just talk about this important moment and how we got here. Because to be honest with you, during the pandemic, we did an amazing job, and we did it together, of reducing food insecurity in the US. Think about that. At the time of a pandemic, we came together to actually drive down one of the challenges in our society. Post-pandemic, though, things tend to head back to where they were pre-pandemic. And so there are really three things that I would want you to know about our fight against food insecurity that has put it in the spot that it is today. The first is that the supply of food is down. So during the pandemic, we gained additional financial support from the government. That gave us more food to put into the food system, and we were able to get more of that food out through to people across the US. Since then, a lot of those programs have ended completely, and other programs have declined over time. So just think basically less food coming into our food safety net. So supply down and demand is up. It won't be surprising to you why demand is up. It's largely because of inflation. So everyone, I think, has felt in one way or another the increase of cost of food. But it's not just food, it's rent, it's energy, it's transportation. All of these things impact all of us. But if you're living at the poverty line or at the food insecurity line, and all of those go up, it can tend to push more people below the line and in need of our services. So think demand up, supply down. We are still, if that was just it, just those two, we would continue to do everything we can to feed as many Americans as we can. But there's a third thing that makes this moment even bigger right now, and that is we're at a moment where there are legislative actions going through around the budget. And as that goes through, we've already seen a proposal on the House side, and now they're working through one on the Senate side. And the question is, how big an impact would that have on our food security safety net? And I just want to give you one set of numbers that'll help give you a sense for how big it is. So last year, Feeding America and all of our partners, our 60,000 partners and 200 food banks, distributed almost 7 billion meals. Think of the scale of that. Think about how many Americans that we impacted with 7 billion meals. That's a lot. But to put it into context, SNAP, or the food stamp part of the safety net, does 9 out of every 10 meals that goes to someone with food insecurity. So 9 from SNAP and then 1 from us. The current cuts in SNAP that are being contemplated would reduce the amount of SNAP to the extent of more than the full 7 million meals that we served last year. So it's a major impact to us. Imagine if you were running a food bank or a food shelf and you had to distribute twice as many meals or feed twice as many people. That's why now is a very important moment to us and to the people that we serve. It's important that we impact both the legislation, but also food and funds that we have to serve our neighbors. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We've got an incredible panel. And so let's get into that. Let me first introduce the panel. First, we have Vince Hall. He's the Chief Government Relations Officer, and I always say he's the most popular guy. I'm not sure he's the most popular, but he's certainly the most in demand right now. So thanks for joining us, Vince. And then we have three incredible food bank CEOs. We have Michaela Kumpke from the Food Bank of Lincoln. We have Milt Liu from St. Mary's Food Bank in Arizona, and we have our very own here in Minnesota, our interim CEO, Sarah Moberg from Second Harvest Heartland. I'm going to start with the food bank CEOs and just get a sense for. I talked about the demand being up and supply being down. What does it feel like right now, Sarah? Can you give us a sense for what it feels like on the ground, and then we'll go around to the other food bank CEOs.
Sure, thanks, Sean. And certainly your opening comments resonated with what we are seeing and feeling here in Minnesota. The need in the community is certainly on the rise. And so our food shelf visits are continuing to increase as well year over year. And you're right, there simply is not enough food to meet all of that demand. And relative to some of the policy changes that have happened recently, the federal food supply has already, been cut as a result of changes to the Emergency Food Assistance Program, TFAP. And at Second Harvest Heartland, in the month of May, our federal food supply was down 50% versus last year. That is a significant pullback in the amount of food that we have available to send through our network. At a state level, we recently they pulled back about $1 million worth of funding that would have gone to rescue produce out in the fields. And that's the equivalent of roughly 4 million pounds of produce that may not be available for the hunger relief system. We're working hard to source creatively, to build relationships with those growers, to increase our connections, to try to backfill as much of that food as possible. But it is not easy work, and it is tough going in a moment where really the community needs that food right now.
Terrific. Why don't you go, Milt? Oh, you're on mute. All right, Milt, we'll come back to you. Why don't you go, Michaela?
All right. How does it feel? It feels heavy, and it feels uncertain. And it feels like neighbors who need us most also have a sense of uncertainty because of the rapid pace of changes and the size of changes. I would point to a story about a woman named Carol who is in her 70s, and she read about a program that we offer that it's called Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By World, which we address root causes of poverty and help understand the issues that maybe lead to generational poverty or situational poverty. And Carol reached out and she said, I feel like maybe at 70 something, I may not have a lot to offer from taking this class personally. She said, but I do feel like my perspective is important to share with other maybe younger single moms. And she said, but here's the thing. I know that you guys offer a stipend to participate in this program. And I'm a little concerned that if I engage in this conversation, that stipend will be just enough to throw me off of my SNAP benefits. And I just think, what an insane feeling and reality. Here's a woman who has lived knowledge and experience that she can impart, and she's really having to question using her voice to help inform others, and all at the risk of her access to food. And I think that just speaks to the nonsensical place that it feels like we're in this moment.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Michaela. Go ahead, Milt.
Okay, sorry about that. So just following up on what Michaela said, when we talk to neighbors, what they tell us is that due to the rising costs, Sean, that you talked about in food, housing, and electricity, our neighbors tell us that they are using us as a bridge to get to the end of the month. By getting food from food banks, this allows them to take those dollars and buy prescriptions or fill their gas tank or pay their electricity bill. And if you think about that, no one should have to decide between providing shelter or food to their children. And I think that's the issue that a lot of our neighbors are facing today. And I specifically want to talk a little bit about what's happening in rural communities. I happen to be in Mojave County today at one of our partners. It's about 3 hours northwest of Phoenix. And here, Sean, you talked about 1 in 5 children living in a food insecure household. Here in Mojave County, that's 1 in 4. So if you think about a classroom of 20 kids, over 5 of those kids are uncertain about where they're going to get their next meal. And further north, we service the tribal communities. And in the tribal communities, 1 in 3 children live in a food insecure household. So this is very real. These are folks who are our neighbors. And I just want everyone to understand that even post-COVID, this challenge has gotten even greater than I think many of us knew.
It's really helpful, Milt, to understand like it's not evenly spread across communities. Sarah, I'm kind of curious on the, when you just have less food, but the same or more people showing up, how do you get, what specifically do you do? Do you give same people less food or do you, I know the food goes out through agencies. How do you decide what agencies get what food?
Yeah, well, so over the last year or so, we have worked really hard to invest and improve our data and analytics capabilities. And that has really helped us to see where are the areas of greatest food insecurity and the areas where that they have the least amount of access to the hunger relief network. And so through that data, we have been working to try to convene in those hard to reach areas and convene local nonprofits, maybe local food shelves, to really come up with community informed programs and solutions that can sustain over time to help bring more food to where it's needed. But those are very tough questions, Sean.
Sure. What's it look like for you, Michaela?
Yeah, I would say some of the work that we're thinking about is our strategic planning and how we approach that when the resources keep getting limited. We want to make sure that we're still centering our neighbors, much like Feeding America with their strategic framework. In our service area, we're engaging in conversations directly with our neighbors as well as with our partner agencies and launching a partner advisory council, which I know is not novel to some across the network, but it is part of that resource and best practicing that we have, the strength of the network, and then getting things like this up and going so that we can hear directly from our partner agencies the stresses and concerns that they have so that we can make these adjustments in ways that do the least amount of harm. Because to your point, we don't have limitless resources. And these decisions, as Sarah said, they're not enjoyable to make. They're not easy. We know we didn't sign up for easy in this work, but we do sign up for compassion and seeing our neighbors. And so trying to do that the best way we can.
Really helpful. Milt, you were talking about communities where the need is greater. A lot of times those communities also are the places where the cost to distribute food is higher.
Yes.
When resources get tighter, how do you make those trade-offs?
Yeah, well, we've been working with our partners, especially in rural communities. I told you that our neighbors are telling us that the back half of the month is toughest for them. Yeah. And what our agencies tell us is that they see that through the spikes in the visits that they get in the back half of the month. So we've been working closely over the last couple of months to make sure that we are actually providing more food in the back half of the month. Previously, it was pretty consistent. Yeah. And so we've had to adjust our operations to reflect that. I think the other thing, and it became apparent to me in my visits yesterday, is we had to stretch. We're trying to stretch the food that we had, and we had to make some cuts due to some of the cuts that we got from the federal government. And we made a decision, I still remember this a month ago, where we decided that we were not going to have peanut butter in a box for a couple of weeks. And I thought, and as we sat around the room, we said, would anybody notice? Well, in my visits yesterday, they told us. They told us that they could see that something had changed. It was only one item, but peanut butter is a cheap source of protein and something really valuable. And I thought maybe that would not be felt as much as I realized. So it's just very real what's happening, and it trickles down to what our neighbors are able to receive from us.
It's a really good example. So Vince, I know you've heard these stories from across our food banks in the US. Where do you think the food system is right now, pre-legislation changes?
Yeah, it's a very, very historically unprecedented moment for the charitable food system in the United States, Sean. I mean, I am very honored to serve as the Chief Government Relations Officer for Feeding America, but I was also honored to be a CEO of one of our 200 partner food banks. And as CEO of Feeding San Diego, I saw a reality as a food banker that every day we fell short in our mission. Every day, as hard as we worked and as aggressively as we sourced food and as rapidly as we expanded our distributions, we still weren't able to reach every neighbor in need. Now we're in a situation years later where the whole food banking system in this country is literally stretched to the breaking point. To give you an example, the unemployment rate and demand at food distributions have always moved in a synchronized fashion. This is the first moment in the history of food banking dating back to the 1960s that those indices have moved in opposite directions. That is, that we are seeing record high demand at food distributions, the highest in over a decade, at the same time that we're seeing very low unemployment rates. And so that suggests that the system is absolutely stretched to the breaking point. The serious cuts in federal support for food banks that have occurred in the last 6 months have exacerbated an already problematic situation. And it means really that there's no resiliency left in the system. That is, if we have a series of natural disasters, which we will, or we have an economic slowdown, a recession, or if there's policy changes to federal nutrition programs that shift more of the responsibility for solving hunger from the federal government to the charitable food system, that the demand will very quickly exceed the supply of food within the charitable system. So this is indeed a very precarious moment for the charitable food system, and we are ill-equipped at this moment to absorb significant increases in demand, but we're also, frankly, struggling very, very hard to replace the missing foods which have disappeared from our loading docks over the last 5 to 6 months, just to sustain the current levels of distribution.
Yeah, I think if people weren't that close to it, they would look at the challenge and say, but isn't it something like the challenge we faced in COVID? And it feels actually very different from the challenge of COVID. In many ways, COVID was amazing in that we received a lot of food, and it was really the challenge was on muscling up our volunteer corps or the people who were distributing the food. What went through all our partner agencies, but we had the food. This feels like we could still step up to the moment. I think on the people side, we've sort of proved that to ourselves, but we don't have the food to distribute. So it feels like a gap that leaves us short of our ability to step up in some way.
Yeah,
So
it's really a great point. The infrastructure is there to solve hunger in every county in the United States. We have specialized delivery models that reach active duty military families through on-base distributions or at schools that primarily serve those families. We have relationships with veterans organizations to reach veterans across the country. We have, as was discussed earlier, a much stronger commitment to listening to the people we serve and bringing to them the food and services that they say they need to thrive on national scale. And so, you know, solving rural hunger, as you said before, is expensive. You're moving smaller quantities of food over great distances to serve smaller populations. But it is something we are passionately committed to doing. And so we measure ourselves and we hold ourselves accountable to serving every neighbor in need, regardless of zip code. So the infrastructure is there, but you're absolutely right, Sean. It's at the end of the day, the biggest constraint on this system is the funds that are necessary to operate the system and the food that is necessary to flow through the system.
So I'm going to stick with you, Vince, for a minute here, just to go from sort of cuts that have already happened to potential cuts that are, you know, that could be even more significant and have a bigger impact on us, even than the things that have been cut to date. Can you give us a little of what's already happened and what is at stake here in the work that's going on right now?
Absolutely. You know, just since January, we have seen significant cancellations of funding for programs that are designed to bring food right to the loading docks of local food banks. There has been a steep reduction in the amount of TFAP, which is an acronym for the Emergency Food Assistance Program, and $500 million of funding that was announced in October of last year was summarily canceled in February of this year. And many food banks, all of them, in fact, saw those deliveries in their systems. They were planning distributions based on the product types and quantities that were hard scheduled to hit their loading docks on certain dates. And then they just disappeared. They were just canceled. Food banks over several years have been developing strong, robust partnerships with local agriculture, including disadvantaged farmers, to source food for the food bank under an innovative new federal program called the Local Food Purchase Assistance Program. But it builds resiliency in local food systems and lifts up farmers and producers who are in community with the very neighbors that food goes to serve. And an additional $500 million that was announced for that program in October of last year was summarily canceled. There are more programs like that I could discuss, but it has been a hard hit for America's food banks for sure. The current legislation pending before Congress is so large and impactful that it's almost difficult to put into words. You gave some very staggering, sobering statistics, Sean, at the beginning of the call about the budget reconciliation bill moving through Congress currently. And the cuts to the SNAP program, which, as you said, provides 9 meals for every 1 meal provided by food banks, would result in an almost incalculable level of increased demand at food distributions. We've been working so hard in a nonpartisan fashion with innovative partners from all over the country to lift up the voices of our neighbors, to make them heard in this debate. But it is not a promising outlook for our neighbors when you look at the way this bill is moving through Congress in a very, very rushed fashion, without adequate hearings, without a lot of deliberation, and you know, cutting $300 billion over 10 years from the SNAP program. That's about a third of the program. Now, many of our neighbors would see reduced SNAP benefits, which they would then turn to food banks to try to absorb. And many of our neighbors would be removed entirely from the program, seeing their benefits essentially go to zero. And then they would turn to food banks for the entirety of that gap. You know, as Milt said already, we see increases in demand during certain times of the month, and neighbors are showing up with EBT cards that have zero balances on them because we don't have benefit adequacy today. But if you take into account the changes that are posed in this legislation, the situation will grow far worse. So we are activating as a network in advocacy work, grassroots advocacy, grass tops advocacy, direct lobbying here in Washington at a scale that the Feeding America Network has never done in its entire history. because the stakes have never been higher.
I appreciate that. And the Feeding America board, I know, is going with you to DC next week. So hopefully we can have an impact on this. Can you give a little bit of the timing for the deliberation here with the Senate and how that looks going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, as you pointed out, the bill passed the House of Representatives a few weeks ago. The bill is pending in the Senate right now. We could see floor activity as early as Wednesday of next week. Currently, the bill is being reviewed by the parliamentarian to understand whether certain provisions of the bill have to be stricken because of the rules. But we could see a vote on this package as soon as the end of next week. They have committed to getting it to the president's desk for a signature by the 4th of July. Importantly, the bill does have to go back to the House of Representatives for a concurrence vote. We, at this time, don't expect that the House will attempt to further modify the bill. We expect that the Senate version will be the final version and it will go to the House for a straight up or down vote. But again, the timing is they're hoping to get all of this into law by the 4th of July.
Wow, that's an ambitious timing. All right, let me come back to the CEOs. And Milt, why don't we start with you? You heard, I know you knew all this, but you heard what Vince shared and the implications for food banks across the country. How are you thinking about it, and how's your team thinking about what could come to be if this legislation passes?
Yeah, I think, what we've been dealing with to summarize what Vince is talking about, what we've dealt with in the last couple of months is a reduction in supply of food. And now what Vince is talking, what could happen is we'll see an increase in demand for our services. That's not a good combination, right? Reduction in supply, increase.
I think
in
that's
demand.
basic econ.
Yeah, just it's like on a 1+1, right? So I think that's what we're dealing with. We are doing a couple of things. One is, I gave you an example where we're trying to stretch a little bit, stretch the resources that we have. But the reality is that the math tells us that, today we're fortunate with our community support to provide Arizonans with over 100 million meals a year. If these SNAP cuts were to go into effect, the ask would be 250 to 300 million meals. So we estimate that is 2 to 3x versus of what we do today. The math just doesn't work. We would never be in a position to do that. So we're looking at ways of stretching. We're looking at our private sources of food. We're trying to find ways to make that more robust. And then finally, especially in rural communities where we think it would be felt most acutely, we're investing in those partners. We're trying to get them ready for this potential increase in demand. And I'll tell you, in rural communities, it's more food deserts. There is not as large a social safety net in rural communities as there is in cities like Phoenix. So in cities like Phoenix, there are a number of agencies. Where I am today in Kingman, Arizona, there isn't. There is the food pantry that we support, and there's an organization that serves the homeless that we support as well. But there isn't much else, and so that's why we're really focused on strengthening the resiliency of our rural partners because we think that's where it will be felt the most.
Thanks, Milt. Michaela, how are you thinking about it? And is it just solving it with trying to get more food, or how are you thinking about the problem?
I would say in part, it's a little bit like what we discussed in the preparation for this conversation, the reminder that advocacy is a form of feeding people and having these conversations so that we understand that the food policies do have a true effect. I don't even know that it's a ripple. It feels like a wave, that it really impacts how we all as food bankers are able to do our work. I would say food bankers are an ever willing and capable, determined group. And when we have the strength of community, we feel it and our neighbors feel it. And I think about, the giving day that here where I am in Lincoln, Nebraska, you know, in May, excuse me, we had our Give to Lincoln Day, and it resulted in more than 27,000 members of the Lincoln community donating more than $9.5 million. And I think what we're seeing, and the Food Bank of Lincoln was at the top of that leaderboard of organizations. So what we're seeing is the community understands the value of feeding people. And all we're asking is that we get that same support from all areas, because no one group can make this all happen. It takes all of us working together. And so it's a continued commitment to those things. And being able to direct the food to the areas and the populations who we know are at greatest need. And in some ways, it feels like a moral injury when we can't even use the words safely to talk about the most disadvantaged populations. So it's like there are handcuffs to do the work, and it is just simply basic need of feeding.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, are you looking at having to cut programs, or are you like, I know communities are amazingly generous when they know there is a need around feeding people. Are you out in the community? How are you approaching it?
Sure. Communities are amazingly generous, and I love being a very proud Minnesotan. And, you know, when I think about some of the numbers that both you and Vince shared and how that would land in Minnesota, if these cuts go through, we are looking at, 45,000 Minnesotans losing their SNAP benefits. We expect that many of those would seek help at food shelves. And the supply and demand component is real. And so it is forcing us to look at where do we prioritize programs and spending, and in order to maximize the impact out in the community. One of the things I'm most excited about over the course of the next couple of months is an effort that we have going statewide with other food banks and hunger relief partners, and including our state Department of Children, Youth, and Families. We are all coming together to try to think about the holistic system. And in this kind of moment of crisis, how might we look different, act different, work together differently in order to become more resilient? And a great example that I have of that happening in South Minneapolis is, think of two food shelves that are operating within a couple blocks of each other. One food shelf is focused on food, and the other food shelf has a little bit of food and a lot of other support services that they offer the community. And those two food shelves decided to consolidate and combine all of the food offerings out of one of their organizations, and that allowed the other organization to more uniquely and differentially focus on some of those other support services. So that's the level of really collaboration and partnership and thinking differently that we know and we are up for moving into these next several months.
That's really helpful. I think it's great to hear of looking for efficiencies. I'm always amazed as I go to different food banks, how resourceful our food banks are. Michaela, I want to come back to you just for 1 second. I am sure you are having conversations with donors, and as you do, what's the tone of the conversations? Are people aware? Are they? I'm just kind of curious what you're hearing.
Yeah, I would say that our community foundation and private foundations are pretty well plugged in. They always appreciate like invitations to these kinds of conversations or the things that we're doing to keep folks looped. Our general donor base, I think that awareness is increasing, and that there's a heightened sense of how can I help in a different way that is starting to make an impact as well. But people are across the spectrum. And I would say what we're starting to see is an elevated concern, because people are really starting to understand the impacts are real on our work and on our neighbors. That is the work.
Yeah. Milt, what are you hearing?
Yeah, I would say the same.
Yeah.
I think there's been an education process. I think even amongst food bankers, but also funders about the severity of these cuts and what they mean. So I think there's an elevated sense of the risk here, but we also know we're short on time. So I think there's a huge education opportunity, and things, forums like this, I think will really help.
So Vince, I got a couple questions for you. One of them was triggered by a comment you made a couple minutes ago, and that is we're talking about the people we're feeding, but there's implications for farmers and producers across all of this work. Can you just help people understand some of the implications from the changes and what it feels like on the farming and producing community?
Yeah, it's a great question because we've heard from a number of farmers and associations that represent agriculture and other food producers. And there's deep concern on a couple of levels. I mean, first of all, the food purchasing power of the SNAP program is a major driver of food production in the United States. So taking that much purchasing power out of the food system is going to have reverberations across all of the supply chain, and not just farmers, but retailers and wholesalers and shippers and packing sheds and everybody in that process is going to be negatively impacted. It's estimated that for every $1 invested in SNAP benefits, there's over $1.50 in economic activity that is stimulated in local economies. The number of rural grocery stores, as an example, that are dependent on SNAP dollars is staggering. And so losing those grocery stores would mean not just losing them for SNAP recipients, but losing them for the whole rural community, which will increase food insecurity in the whole community because now the entire town has to drive 1, 2, or 3 towns over to find access to good food. Additionally, there's the problem of many of the folks who work to harvest the crops, who work in the packing sheds, who are the labor force of our agricultural sector, are themselves eligible and participate in the SNAP program based on their wages and expenses. And for them to not be able to achieve sufficient nutrition, to not feed their kids, to not keep themselves nourished, will have impacts for the labor force that drives the agricultural sector. So those are two of the most immediate impacts.
Yeah, I think that return on a SNAP dollar is probably one of the most startling facts across the whole food insecurity ecosystem. All right, we'll wrap it up with you, Vince, on there's a lot of funders here online listening to this dialogue, and I think the CEOs gave really good texture just to how the challenge that is there already, but also the challenge that lies ahead. What kind of advice or direction do you have for how can people help if they're on the funding side?
Well, supporting local food banks is an extraordinary opportunity to have a direct impact in local communities that is very measurable, very tangible. That is obviously an extraordinary opportunity to help improve the safety net of the charitable food system that sits right below the safety net of federal nutrition programs, especially at a time when federal nutrition programs are facing such severe cuts. But I would emphasize advocacy as well. I think that there are 42 million people on the SNAP program. There are 50 million people in our country who accessed the charitable food system last year. If we further invest and activate in advocacy and helping people to use their voice in our political advocacy, not campaign necessarily. I'm just talking about being in touch with elected officials to represent their circumstances, to associate the things that they say with their own self-interest, to help punch through the information ecosystems that close people off from larger truths, and use advocacy to connect people with self-interest and then to create advocacy for that self-interest. And by self-interest, I just mean nutrition, housing, affordable monthly essentials. So we've made great strides in advocacy. But it is a laborious process. It is expensive. But it is the thing that ultimately in the long term is going to help us get to those root causes of hunger so that the charitable food system can be a source of temporary emergency food relief, which is what it should be, as opposed to a permanent and sustaining part of families' monthly budget equations.
I think that's really good thoughts for those online. I'm going to turn it over here to Maggie so we can tackle some Q&A that has come through the chat. Maggie, can I turn it over to you to take over navigation?
Yes, definitely. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for being here. I am Maggie McCracken. I'm with the Minneapolis Foundation, and we don't have enough time for all of the questions in the registration. You submitted questions here in the chat, Q&A. We've got some questions. We are committed to getting you some responses to all of those, but just want to take a couple here, a couple of themes and a couple of questions before Sean closes us out for the day. The first one that I wanted to do is really, Sarah, you talked a little bit about collaboration. Michaela, maybe you could hit on, there's a theme in these questions about how are you thinking about collaboration in a different way? And would love to just have you maybe touch on what that looks like in your work as you think about some of these shifts.
You bet. So I appreciated what Sarah offered today and made my own note about partner agencies, thinking differently and how they can join forces. I think that's part of innovation during a time like this. I also think about collaborations that, I serve on our local major hospital system board, and thinking about, I'm not an expert in Medicaid, right? But I think about collaborating with the hospital system, and we're now going to join together to help advocate with each other so that we can represent our areas of expertise together for the good of our neighbors. And so I think looking at these different collaborations, these are opportunities if we see them and if we find willing partners. And so just looking at it a little bit that way, trying something different. And then the collaboration with our partner agencies again, and thinking about what is it that they need most? And frankly, it's food. And so thinking about how do we continue to be a champion and tell that story in partnership and bring those voices closer to the front.
Thanks, Michaela. Another one, Vince, I'm going to come to you for this one, is just thinking about questions about how will these potential federal level impact state and communities? We've heard a little bit about communities, but maybe talk about the state implications and what that looks like.
Absolutely. A big component of the pending bill, the Budget Reconciliation Act, would shift significant costs of the SNAP program to states. And in 10 states, SNAP is administered by counties. And so in those jurisdictions, the cost impacts would directly reverberate to county governments. But effectively, the federal government has always paid 100% of the cost of SNAP benefits, and the states and the feds have split the administrative costs of the program 50-50. The bill that's pending now would increase the state share of administrative costs to 75%. And in many states, it would cause a very significant and very expensive shift of the cost of actual SNAP benefits onto the state budgets. Now, all but one states have a balanced budget amendment. They don't have the resources that the federal government has. They're already struggling, and I'm sure many of you are aware of your own state budget situation with trying to fund public education and other public safety and other critical state priorities. It is the case that almost all states are extremely ill prepared to absorb major costs associated with SNAP benefits. So that causes a couple of problems. I mean, first of all, we may see, in fact, a retreat from our national commitment to treating every person facing hunger with equal compassion in the form of SNAP benefits. And your ability to access help may be dependent on your zip code, because each state is going to have greater flexibility to decide SNAP eligibility and SNAP benefits. Secondly, it is a transfer of sort of the overall administrative authority of SNAP to the degree that the Congressional Budget Office has stated some states could even stop offering the SNAP program entirely if they weren't prepared to pay their share of the benefits and their share of the administrative fees that would be created. So this is an extraordinary redefinition of how the SNAP program is funded at its core, and would create enormous economic hardship for the states as they look at either raising taxes, which is very difficult to do in most states, cutting spending to other priority programs to help fund SNAP, or, as is the most likely scenario, simply cutting SNAP benefits to people who need them the most. And that's going to reverberate through to local governments as well.
Thanks, Vince. Maybe one more, and maybe Sarah or Mel, I'll kind of let you two decide, but there's a theme about food rescue as we think about access to food. And I'd love to see if either of you could talk a little bit about what that looks like and how either existing, kind of where we are today, and whether these cuts help or hinder kind of what you're hearing and seeing from a food rescue perspective as a part of your work.
I'll go first. Food rescue is an incredibly important part of our work. Regardless of what's happening in the federal policy side, we continue to build that part of our supply chain, and it's incredibly important. We work very hard on rescuing food from grocery stores in our territory. I think we work with, in Arizona, 500 individual grocery stores every week. Between ourselves and partner agencies that we have set up partnerships with. So it's an incredible source. We are not just the largest food distribution organization in Arizona, we're actually the largest food rescue organization in Arizona. So we continue to work with farmers, grocery stores, manufacturers, all up and down the food chain to make sure that we are getting food and keeping food away from the waste stream and making sure that it ends up with our neighbors.
Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Milt on that one. I am wondering if I could go to the chat line and just pull out a question on the donor impact of donating to a food shelf versus a food bank.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would just say both are important and critical, and the impact is different. And so from a food shelf perspective, they absolutely need donations to help staff their facilities, to help with operational expenses. And from a food bank perspective, we really look for donations to be able to make choices that bring scale and scope and then benefit to the food shelves. And so a great example is we will go out to a grower and pay for the labor, the packaging, the transportation to bring secondary produce back into the food bank at a quantity that a food shelf wouldn't even know how to handle. And then we take those large quantities, break them into smaller quantities that then go out to food shelves and eventually to neighbors. And so it truly is an end-to-end system where investment and support of both are critical in this moment.
That's great. Thanks so much. And again, everybody, we will pull all the questions that we have, and we'll make sure to get some responses out to everybody as a part of the follow-up, including how to really do that advocacy work. Vince talked about reaching out. We've pulled a little one-sheeter together on just talking a little bit more about what that looks like tangibly to make that as easy as possible for folks who want to step in there. But Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kind of close us out.
That sounds great. Thanks, Maggie. Let me just first say thank you to our panel for joining us and giving us a bit of the real on what's going on right now. I do want to thank the community foundations and all of you who are online for your interest in the topic, but more importantly, for serving the people who are struggling with food insecurity. We know it's going to be a greater challenge here going forward. I just want you to know that the Feeding America Food Bank Network from top to bottom, I just want you to know how committed we are to serving our neighbors. We see this challenge. I hope I didn't scare you away with the challenge. We're not scared of the challenge. We're engaged by it. And we will do everything that we possibly can. I continue to be amazed at the new heights that whether it's staff or volunteers are willing to go in order to take care of their neighbors. So hopefully this provided you with insights in a way that inspired you to get engaged in what is going to be a difficult time here going forward. I think Maggie may have said it up front. I do have funds at the Minneapolis Foundation, and I'm thinking about. I always think about, why and how am I going to use those funds into the community? But now, it's also where and when. And for me, being able to contribute right now in a way that I know will help against this fight, and doing it now, whether it's through funds or through advocacy, it's clear that the when is now. And so thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Take care now.